Welcome back to another teacher training video from Pentecostal Publishing House. Today I'm excited to have with us Sarah Zenobia. She's going to talk to us today about ministering to students with special needs. So welcome, Sarah, and tell us a little bit about yourself and your ministry to students with special needs.
Okay, so my name is Sarah Zenobia. I am a speech-language pathologist. So another term for my job is a speech therapist. I've worked in outpatient setting, home health setting, school settings, but I currently work at a nonprofit organization called the Center for Autism Education. I work in the school-based program for people with disabilities from kindergarten to 12th grade. So we provide education, functional training, therapies, and behavior intervention to our students. So at my job, I work with the speech and language therapy aspect with my students. So I am developing treatment goals, treatment plans that help with their communication skills. But with my students, I have to think about, I have to consider every aspect of my students' lives. So I have to consider environmental factors, social skills, future plans, functional communication skills, assistive technology. So it's definitely working with every aspect of the student's life to develop an appropriate plan.
Wow. All right. Well, with your expertise, we're really blessed then to apply that to the church setting. So knowing what you do about students with disabilities, when it comes to our teachers at church, what are some ways they would go about determining if a student needs extra support in a classroom?
Right. So I always say when you have a concern, definitely ask the parents and the caregivers of the student first. That is your most important, most useful resource that you can have. Also, being a speech-language pathologist, my expertise is in communication. And there are many different ways that people can communicate. So when you're considering a student's needs or can have a concern about a student, think about what that student is doing and what that student might be communicating.
Yeah.
So for instance, I like to give examples. So for instance, if you have a student that can't seem to sit still in class, instead of being frustrated or think this is distracting, consider what is that student communicating to you?
Sure.
The student might be communicating, hey, I need movement in my learning.
Right.
Or I need to have fidgets in my hands to really pay attention.
Very good.
Another example is if you have a student that cries when you have loud music or when you all sing together or shout together. Those are fun things, but you may have a student that gets upset when that happens. So just thinking about what is that student communicating? The student might say like, I don't like loud noises, so let's all whisper together. So these are things that you can just think about, ask the parents about, and then just find ways to support that student in your classroom.
That is excellent. And I know there are teachers watching right now that's registering. We've probably all had a student, and without this understanding, we may have made some of those assumptions. So this is very, very good training. Okay, what else, I guess is what I want to say. What other things should our teachers consider if perhaps they feel they have a student who may have a need of some kind?
Mm-hmm. So if you have students with disabilities in your class or you have students that you have concerns about, we have to remember that there are so many disabilities and that every person is an individual. We are all different, we're all unique.
Sure.
And so I saw a saying the other day that I wanted to share with our Sunday school teachers that it said that if you have met one person with autism spectrum disorder, then you have met one person with autism spectrum disorder.
Very good.
And I love that saying because it shows that it's just a reminder that every single person is an individual. We all have different personality traits. We all have places that we excel. We all have strengths. We all have needs. And so when you have a student with a disability in your class, it's really important to remember that person's an individual with individual traits. Also, when you have a student with a disability in your class, I will say it again, the parents and the caregivers are your most important resource to have. At my school, we have a yearly meeting that we have, and it's called an IEP meeting.
Right.
So it's an individualized education plan. So school professionals and parents come together, and the student, if that's appropriate, to think about a plan that we can put in place to support that student in that school year. So the individualized education plan has helped so many students get their needs met in the educational system. And I really think that the church can use this concept to meet the needs of these students in the church setting. There's an amazing resource on the Able Ministry UPCI Facebook page called the Spiritual IEP. So the Spiritual IEP is set up kind of like an IEP in a school, and it's set up to ask questions and bring about information that the church staff and the parents want to talk about to best support this student in the classroom. So in the spiritual IEP, it's set up for a team to come together. This team can consist of pastors and youth pastors and assistant pastors and Sunday school teachers, ministry leaders, parents, maybe even the student, if that's appropriate, to just all come together and let's talk about questions and things that we need to put in place to better support the student in the church setting. So for instance, the spiritual IEP has a question on it that asks if there's anything that a Sunday school teacher needs to know before decorating their Sunday school classroom. So in this situation, the parents may say, well, hey, my student has difficulty with abrupt changes. So maybe my student can come in and help you decorate.
Yeah.
Maybe my student needs portions of the classroom decorated at a time. Let's do this gradually.
Sure.
Or maybe my student needs to just come in and see the decorations before all the peers show up.
Right.
You know, there's just so many different ways that we could support that student.
Sure.
And that is something that can be discussed in this spiritual IEP. Of course, with my specialty, I think about communication, which is such an important aspect of a student's life. And so in these spiritual IEP meetings, I would ask, how does the student communicate their wants and needs? How does the student communicate their feelings? Do they need a picture cue? Do they need assistive technology? Do they need, are they verbal? Just all of these different things that we can talk about where the parents can give all this really great information.
Very good. I imagine there are some light bulbs that are going off right now because I honestly hadn't thought about that until our conversation. When we have the change of a quarter, sometimes that's even the change of classes. Mm-hmm. So it may be that with younger children, I won't put an age on it, but you may have a student come in class first day, and now we went from the cowboy western to Under the Sea, and there are fish coming down from the ceiling, all this great stuff that we like, and it's fun and adds excitement for some students. We may have a child that walks in, sees all of that, they get overwhelmed, and then they have an emotional reaction that maybe in the past, lack of understanding, it never crossed my mind until this conversation. That could absolutely be a problem for some students. It's sensory overload. Right. And so just not even thinking from that direction, perhaps we have in some of our abrupt changes with our classes, moving classrooms, or just a new quarter of decor. It may have been overwhelming for students in the past, and we just didn't have the understanding to realize that possibility. So some really great strategies you've heard on the decor side is one example, but one example of many ways where we just need to think about the potential impact for students who have a different level of needs and support they need. So that's really good. Also, here we go. We're going to get back to the conversation, but I love that spiritual IEP. It's so important. It's so important. I know you mentioned you can get that from the Able Ministry Facebook. Yes. Yeah, that's where we get that. Also, if you purchase curriculum for children from Pentecostal Publishing House, a little plug, it's in the digital resources when you buy curriculum for children from Pentecostal Publishing House. So we're all working together to make sure that we can have that tool because it's so important. So important. All right. What about some other resources that teachers who recognize they have children with special needs in their class, other things that would be helpful for them as well? Yeah, right. So I'm going to reiterate it. Your parents and your caregivers of that student are so important. Sure. They're the most important people on your team other than just the student, him or herself. So make sure you're always talking to that parent. Make sure you're always planning with that parent. Also, we live in an age
where information about each disability and ideas on how to support people with disabilities, it's just a click away.
That's true.
It's just a search away. So when you have a student with a disability in your class, I say, like, do your research. Research that disability. Research characteristics of that disability.
Sure.
Research ideas on how to support people with that disability. And then when you devise this plan, ask your parents, what do you think about what I've researched? Do you think it will help the student? So I have learned, whenever I'm working with my students, that you do your research and you develop your plan and you ask all these people, and then you might implement the plan and it may not work, or it may not be perfect the first time.
Right.
And that just means what we talked about earlier, everyone's an individual.
Right.
So this plan that you create has to be a working document. It has to continue to grow with the student. It has to change with the student. So don't expect it to be perfect the first time, but keep trying. Also, like we talked about, Able Ministries has so many great resources for us. They have disability informational pages, they have resources, they have that spiritual IEP, so definitely go check them out. Join the Facebook page. And then we all have people in our lives that we know that might have a child with a disability, or work with people with disabilities, or have expertise or specialties, like mine is communication. So just be aware of who's in your church, who has those expertise, who can we pull from. Maybe you have a speech language pathologist in your church that doesn't teach Sunday school, but you can still ask them questions. So just be aware of who's in your church, who's around you, and make sure to pull from those people.
Very, very good. I hadn't thought about this with the spiritual IEP. Another thing, the value of our conversation today, hadn't thought about that fact that we're so excited about that spiritual IEP and how it can help churches and families. Didn't think about the fact that we're not going to fill it out once and be done.
Right.
That's great feedback. If you've used that already, take a fresh look periodically. Does it need to be updated in a way that better supports the student with whatever the disability? That's a great point. It's very good advice. I feel like people are really going to be blessed by this conversation. So we've talked about a lot. Let me maybe just ask you to give us one final piece of advice for teachers and all of the wonderful things you've shared. Maybe final advice as we wrap up today.
Yeah. So the most important thing that I think that we can convey today is that we must remember that every single person on this planet is created, chosen, and called by God.
Yes.
In the Great Commission, we are told to go. We're told to go into the entire world. We're told to share the gospel with every single person. In the Great Commission, Jesus does not specify which people get to have the gospel and which people don't. Yeah. And he doesn't put an ability level on who can have the gospel. Right. So he just says to share the gospel with every person. When you are sharing God's word and God's truth to any of your students, you are honoring and obeying the Great Commission. It's important that we as a church provide any supports needed for all people to understand the truth, to understand the promises that God gives us, to understand that we all have a calling on our lives. And so with that being said, I think my biggest piece of advice is to just try. Just try supports, try researching, try the spiritual IEP, try talking to the parents, try promoting inclusion in your Sunday school classrooms. Every effort that you make to support people with disabilities and share the gospel with people with disabilities is you obeying the Great Commission.
Very good.
And then, like I said earlier, my last piece of advice is that everybody is an individual. So make sure that you treat that person with respect and know that they are an individual. And so whenever you're creating these plans, whenever you are trying all of these amazing things, make sure that you are trying to provide support for that individual person.
That's so good. That's so good. I am so appreciative of all of the information you've shared today and your wonderful, wonderful sense of compassion that I'm sure we feel coming across in this. This is an important topic. This won't be the last time that we talk about this, but we really wanted to be sure to give you this good information. Thank you, Sarah, for being part. And stay tuned for more teacher training videos from Pentecostal Publishing House.